Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much, Maria. It's a big pleasure for me to be here this evening to share time and thoughts with you, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A, to all your questions, your comments, because interacting is much nicer than listening to my own voice, which I hear too much. What I want to do in my speech is to, as Maria already said, look at the prospects for Europe and ask whether this is the time for a new bargain. In order to answer that question, which is a bit of a puzzle, I must say, I want to address two simple questions. I always think that the simple questions are the best ones. So I want to start by saying something about where I think that we currently stand. Because I think if you want to look into the future, if you want to answer the question of whether there is room for a new bargain, you need to start with a thorough analysis. So I'll do that. But then I want to go on by looking at where we're heading to. And I won't look into the crystal ball because I learned my lesson. 2010 to 2015, Joe was already making a joke about that. It was not a nice period in my life, I can tell you. But what I learned over the past 10 years that we should be really careful if we look into the crystal ball because things always work out differently than we thought. So what I want to do is I want to look more into the immediate future and ask myself what might happen, but also say what I think should happen. Because as Joe already indicated, I'm a think tanker by profession, so I always try to come up also with ideas of what should be done. So where do we stand? I think what Joe was saying when he was saying you were here 8 months ago, it was a different situation. I fully agree, because I think one of the main characteristics of today is that there is a new sense of optimism. Now, I think one needs to be careful when saying so, but if you are in this town, and we all are, you can feel that there is some sense of optimism. And if we would have been here 1 year ago, so not 8 months, 1 year ago, it was a different situation. We were just after the Brexit vote. We were still very much in what in this town was called the poly-crisis mode. There was a fear that others might follow suit of what happened in the UK, the fear of a domino effect. There was, I would even say, a feeling of collective depression, and you could sense it. And the EU27, so the rest of the EU member states, were trying to display unity, but you could really see how they were struggling, because there was no unity. But they were trying. And there were all these negative expectations. There were the expectations, if you remember back at the end of 2017, there were some people who, 2016, sorry, there were some people who were saying the worst is still ahead of us. The political annus horribilis has not been 16, it will be 17. But today, the situation is better. There is this optimism. There are even people who say that there might be a window of opportunity for changing things, for progressing, for, as Maria said, using the high time to make the union stronger and more resilient. There's this feeling that this window of opportunity might be there. And that has to do, I think, with a number of unifying factors. One is that, which is a bit strange, if you started by talking about Brexit, that Brexit has been a unifying element. It has moved member states closer to each other. It has also shown that the perspective of leaving is not the best of perspectives. I think a second factor, what we should not forget, is Trump. Trump showed what can happen, in which direction things can move, and it created a lot of uncertainties, and uncertainty creates unity. A third element, Joe mentioned that already, is the economic development. I always have a problem when I say this being half Greek, but if you look at the overall situation within the EU27, within the Eurozone, the economic development is positive. If you look at jobs creation, if you look at economic growth. And last but not least, the elections in Austria and the Netherlands and Finland did not lead to Hofer, did not lead to Wilders, did not lead to Le Pen. And they even led to a young person who I think himself 1 year earlier would not have thought would become president. It led to President Macron. So we had a number of unifying elements which created these expectations for a window of opportunity, for new momentum. But I would suggest to all of us that we need to be careful. We need to be careful because, yes, the situation is much better, but we should not forget some of the other characteristics of this European Union. So it's the other side of the coin that's going to shape our future prospects. One is that the polycrisis, which I already mentioned, is not really resolved. Yes, progress has been achieved. Things which we would have thought 10 years ago not being possible were made possible. The worst was avoided, also in the case of Greece, by the way, but not only. But if you look into the individual crises, none of them have been sustainably overcome. And individual crises could reignite. I wouldn't say that that's not possible. The defenses are stronger, but many of the structural deficits which we've had have not been overcome. Euro area crisis. Yes, there was progress, but a lot of the things which had been initiated, which had been put on the table after 2012 or in 2012 for President's Report, 5 President's Reports, a bit technical, but in this audience I know that you're all very knowledgeable. Many of these things have not been put into practice. In many ways, after 2012, after the things which have been put on track, there has not been really much movement. With respect to the migration crisis, yes, the number has gone down, but a lot of the reactions to the migration crisis were ad hoc. There were not structural reactions to the migration crisis. These are just 2 examples showing that the polycrisis is not overcome. Don't get me wrong, as I said, the situation is better, but the EU, I don't think, is yet storm-proof. And future storms will come. We do not know what kind of storms we will see, in which areas, how strong they might be, whether they will be resembling storms which we've seen in the past, over the past years, but storms will come, and we need to be prepared for that. Another characteristic is that these years of polycrisis have led to what I always call a lot of collateral damage. And this collateral damage has an effect not only with respect to the past, but also with respect to the future. It casts a shadow on the EU's ability to progress. Let me just mention some, and I'm only going to use catchwords: distrust and fragmentation between member states, which has increased enormously over the past years. Second, the EU in many corners of Europe is no longer seen as a win-win exercise, something from which everyone profits. Maybe some more, maybe some less, but that feeling of this win-win has been lost. Then there is also the feeling, a sense that we have an increased, not a feeling, it's a reality, we have an increased divergence. An increased divergence in economic terms, but I also think we have a divergence which is even worse, which is a divergence in thinking terms. What I mean is, if you travel around Europe and you talk about the same issue, and you talk to different people in different member states, capitals and beyond, you often get the feeling that people live, I'm going to be strong in my words, live on different planets, that they have experienced the past very differently, that they analyze the situation very differently, which also means with respect to what needs to be done, they have a different starting point. And last but not least, there is despite the optimism I was talking about, there is a wide frustration with the EU as it stands out there. I always say with the EU as it stands because I think that a lot of people still are supportive of European integration. But with respect to the EU as it stands today, a lot of people are critical. And what's different compared to 10, 15 years ago, that this is not only affecting so-called ordinary citizens, also affecting the elites. Economic elites, political elites, cultural elites, intellectual elites are much more critical of the EU as it stands today than they were in the past. These are some of the collateral damages. And the last characteristic of today's union, and that's where I will end with my State of the Union analysis, is that, yes, 2017 was not the political annus horribilis people were fearing, but the populist threat continues to persist. If you look into the individual experience which we've had, for example, in Austria, the victory of van der Bellen was very, very narrow. And in October at the elections, we saw the best result for the FPÖ ever in Austria. In France, Le Pen gained more votes than her father did, despite, I think, a bad finish at the end. Macron only had 24% in the first round, and around 40% of French voted for critical or Eurosceptic parties in the first round of the presidential elections. In the Netherlands, Wilders did not win, which nobody should have thought he could, even before the elections, but he has in many ways determined the direction of his country. So even if they don't win, if the so-called populists do not win, they have a strong effect on their countries. So, and in Germany, we have an AfD with almost 13% for the first time since 1961 that a radical right-wing populist party entered the Bundestag. And it also showed you how split the society in Germany is. So if you look at these examples, it shows you that we should not think that the populist threat is over. And there were many who were saying some months ago that the worst might be behind us. I think we should be cautious because in general, if you look at the phenomenon of so-called populism, it is something which has developed and it has strengthened over the past decade, since the 1960s. And I think the key danger which we're now facing, and we shouldn't omit that when we look at the State of the Union, that there still is a risk. And Maria was indicating that in her introduction with respect to the economy, but I would broaden it. There's a risk of a more regressive, a more nationalistic, a closed, illiberal, authoritarian Europe. There's a risk that people who want to move our societies in a certain direction, which I think most of us would not be happy with, that they are being strengthened, and we see that. And the fundamental reasons for these illiberal forces remain strong. Populism did not come out of the blue. It is in many ways a phenomenon. It's not the source of the problem. And I think that there are a number of factors which are playing into the hands of those who we call populists. One is the polarization of our societies, which you can see everywhere, in Europe, but also beyond. And it helps them to articulate, which is part of their basic DNA of populists, this us versus them logic. Second, you have a strong dissatisfaction of people with their state of affairs, with those in power, with representative democracy. And in many ways, the populist success is a result of challenges which are questioning the prevailing order. So it goes very deep. And last but not least, many people feel very insecure. We often speak about the so-called losers of globalization. I would not use that term because it connotes that we are thinking of socioeconomic insecurities. I am using the term the losers of change, people who feel that change is something which is not acting in their favor. And it's not only the socioeconomic insecurities, it's also insecurities with respect to cultural, societal identity issues, which go very deep and can be felt in many ways. You know, this distinction which people make between the wall people and the web people, the somewheres and the anywheres. I think that is showing the divide which we have in societal and identity terms. And then we have the generational insecurities of many young people feeling that they are left behind and that they might be doomed of being part of a lost generation. And last but not least, technological insecurities, which make people feel that they're being left behind. And all these things are leading to what in German you could nicely call Zukunftsangst, fear about the future. And it also leads to a sentiment of anti-cooperation. And that's why, and that plays into the hand of all these anti-forces, whatever they are, whatever color they have. Again, this is not a European phenomenon, but Europe is much more vulnerable. It's much more vulnerable than other entities because the European Union is not as consolidated as nation states, and it's called into question much faster. So if I look at this entire picture, and I started with optimism, and I will continue with optimism, but I want us to be realistic about the current state of affairs, and I don't want to spoil the party. And I think I was among the first, also the first ones in this town saying that a window of opportunity might be opening. So don't get me wrong, but I think we need to be careful in our analysis and we need to be concrete of what we need to do. And this brings me to my second part of my introductory speech. Where are we heading? I think if you follow the discussion over the past weeks, the past months, you can see that there are rather high ambitions compared to 8 months ago, what Joe was talking about. If you listen to Juncker, if you listen to Macron, if you listen to Tusk, they speak about Juncker, that there is wind back in Europe's sails. Macron is speaking about the need to redefine Europe, the need for a profound transformation of the European Union. We hear Tusk saying that we need to quote, cut the Gordian knots on most sensitive issues. So there seems to be this feeling we can use and should use this window of opportunity. But what could this mean in concrete terms? And that's what I want to discuss now, and then end with, will it really happen? And I want to present some ideas with respect to what it means, or what it could mean, that using the window of opportunity is an option. First of all, I think that this window of opportunity is neither big, nor will it last very long. I think that in terms of time, we might have until the end of 2018. This is going to be the end. We're going to be moving at least close to the end of this institutional cycle. We will be moving towards the European Parliament elections in May 2019. So I think in terms of how long it will be open, this window, end of 2018, would be my guess. And it's not really a big window. I always say it's not a window which opens towards a huge terrace, but it's rather a skylight, somewhere up there. And to get there and to get through it is not going to be easy. And it's not big because there's a strong, what I would call, dogma of realism in the member states. There is not a readiness to have treaty change. There's not a readiness to change the institutional structure of the European Union. There is no readiness for a giant leap. This is not in the cards. So even if there is more of an optimist situation today, this is not what is in the card. And there are huge differences among the EU 27. I was already alluding to that earlier. We have many red lines. And if you discuss with people around the European Union, and I'm doing that, as you can imagine, very, very frequently, you can sense these strong red lines, whether in Germany, in the Netherlands, or wherever else. There are red lines in many places on different issues. And the question is, how do you overcome the blockades which we witnessed over the past years? How can you move on? And I think what we need is some kind, in the title it says bargain, I would use another word. I think what we need is some kind of a package deal. That's what we need to think of today. We need to think and ask ourselves who gets what in exchange for what. If we don't think that way, I think we will not be able to use this window of opportunity. And if we don't use this window of opportunity, we will not overcome stalemate, and we will continue to muddle through as we've done over the past years. And we don't need to reinvent Europe. Some say we need to go as far as to say we need to reinvent Europe. I wouldn't say that that's necessary. I think what we need to do is we need to re-energize the European Union and use this window of opportunity which has opened in order to re-energize Europe and to make it future-proof. But what kind of a bargain do we need? Because saying we need a bargain is easy. What kind of a package deal do we need is easy. I think the answer to that is we need a win-win package deal, which reflects the interests and the concerns of different positions between member states, but also within member states, because we have equally differences within member states as we have between member states. So you need to address these differences through a package deal. You don't need something which is symbolic, you don't need something which is cosmetic, but you also don't need a grand bargain, which would lead you towards the next huge step in terms of European integration. No, you need something which is ambitious and pragmatic at the same time. What should the content of an EU 27 bargain be about? As I said, I want to be more concrete and not only leave you with the impression of a general plea for this kind of a package deal. I think it would have to reflect three main dimensions, and which reflect the diverging concerns within the EU 27. It needs to include the migration dimension, the economic dimension, including the social aspects, and the security dimension. You need to cover all these dimensions if you want to figure how a package deal might look like. Do I think that it is possible? Yes, I think that it is possible. And if you have discussions throughout Europe, you discuss with people, whether they are so-called ordinary citizens or people who are in power or who are shaping decisions, you can see, I think, that there is a potential for a bargain. But you need to start working on that now. As I said, the window of opportunity won't be open for very long. If I look into the individual dimensions, I'll get a bit technical now, but I want to become technical in order to show you in which direction it would be going without losing myself in technicalities. With respect to migration, I think the objective must be that you create a human mobility strategy which is comprehensive. And in order to get there, you will have to strike a balance between what I would call the security camp and the solidarity camp, between those who say we need to focus on the security dimension, who say we need to focus on making sure that we will not be overwhelmed by people coming to Europe, and others who say we need to boost solidarity. Solidarity between member states, but also solidarity with those knocking on our doors and with the countries of origin and of transit. And you need to define what elements could be in order to find a bargain between those two camps. And I think it's possible. I think you can define the individual elements which both sides could be happy with, could suffice from their perspective, and bring these things together. I won't go into the detail of that now. In the economic and in the social dimension, here you need to find a balance between responsibility, between those who say member states need to deliver, they need to reform, and those who argue that we need more solidarity and that we need to strengthen the caring dimension of the EU. So this, I think, is the second balancing act, to balance the different interests between this, as I would call it, responsibility and solidarity camp. While, and that I think makes it not less complicated, but I think it's important, while preserving the principle of unity among the EU 27 and between the Euro countries. I'm not among those who argue that we should move ahead in small circles of member states. I don't think that that is the solution. So I think we need to keep the principle of unity strong. And if you want to balance these two camps, again, there are individual elements which you can do. If you want, we can dwell into that, into the discussion. But I think it is possible. Responsibility, solidarity, caring, to bridge that gap between them, and also to make sure that non-Euro countries will not feel discriminated by future reforms, especially when it comes to economic and monetary union. And then comes the third dimension, and then I'll stop being technical, and that's the security dimension. And I think here, the logic and the situation is different. It's different because you have a broad consensus among the EU 27 to move on when it comes to internal and external security. You do not have the red lines which you have in other areas. I'm not naive. I'm not saying that there are no differences. I know that there are huge divides between member states when it comes to their geopolitical focus, when it comes to the use of force, when it comes to the role of NATO. There are major differences between member states. But there are no red lines. And there's very strong public support. Numbers are telling us that up to 80% of Europeans want the EU to have a stronger role when it comes to world affairs, which makes this area, the security dimension, an area which could be a unifying factor with respect to working out a bargain, with respect to working out that win-win package deal of what I've been talking about. Again, if you implement such a package deal, and by the way, in roughly 10 days, the details of this package deal will be published, so you can also read them in more detail if you want to. If you implement such a package deal, it would lead to more differentiation, as I said, in the area of the euro, with respect to migration, with respect to defense. We would have different groups of member states intensifying cooperation in different policy fields. That would lead to a very complex map of differentiated integration, of a differentiated Europe. And it would be guided, as I said earlier, by functional and by pragmatic needs, and not by the desire to create some kind of a closed Europe. A closed Europe which is institutionalized, which creates a two-tier Europe. So I think that would be the wrong way to go. I know this is a complicated package deal which I've tried to describe, but I think that if we could get to that point and use the window of opportunity to get to that point, the European Union would be able to strengthen its defenses. It would be able to deal with the collateral damage which I've been talking about, create a more of a win-win situation, make sure that this divergence between member states is being bridged or is being reduced. And it could also serve as an inspiration for a potential Franco-German initiative, which I think needs to be very inclusive. It should not be an exclusive German-Franco initiative. It could help with respect to negotiations between member states if you have a concrete idea. It could also help you to foster national and transnational debates about the future of Europe. You've all heard Macron's idea to have democratic conventions. I think if you want to have, and that's my experience, if you want to have these democratic conventions, you have to make them concrete. If you have a general discussion about more or less Europe, or about what the finalité of European integration should look like, I don't think that that will be very fruitful. And such a deal will also help to fight what I mentioned as one of the collateral damages of the Polish crisis, the fragmentation between member states. And it could also help with respect to fighting the polarization within our societies. Although I know that a lot of things will have to be done at member state level when it comes to fighting the polarization within our societies, but it could help. Coming to an end, is such a package deal possible? To tell you the truth, and I'll be very open here, I don't know. I think that there are strong arguments in favor, but there are also strong arguments against. Let me start with those in favor. One is that we have already a very strong commitment by France and Germany, by the governments of France and Germany, by Macron and by Merkel, to present such a joint initiative. And I think that it will be difficult to politically backtrack from that expectation which has been raised. A second argument in favor is that there is a strong willingness in France to reform the country. Macron means it. And it's not only that he means it, but that there is a strong belief of him and those who are advising him that national reforms and European reforms are two sides of the same coin. You need national reforms and you need EU reforms, and one needs the other. And I think that is a strong push with respect to reforming the European Union. Another argument in favor is that Merkel, and I expect her to remain chancellor. I also think that Jamaica is the likely coalition, although I'm not as sure as I was a month ago. That Merkel believes and is ready to invest in Macron. And I think that Brexit and Trump is something which has shown that things can happen which you think are not going to really happen. And there's a fear of what might happen in France after Macron. And that, I think, is a strong motivating element. And if there's a French-German compromise, I think it could be strong enough to also lead to an EU27 deal. It will be complicated, but if it is an inclusive initiative, i.e. reflecting also the interest of the others, it can be the basis to progress. But now comes the other side, the arguments against, and they're equally strong. Those who do not want the EU and EMU to be reformed are already saying Macron will not be able to deliver. If you go to Berlin, if you go to The Hague, this is an argument which you hear. An argument which is then being used to say, if he's not able to deliver, why should we give up too much in a potential initiative between Paris and Berlin? The next issue or argument against is the outcome of the German elections. The German elections, which will lead to a government which will be a much more complex government. Again, I believe it will be Jamaica. It will be a government in which you will have a liberal party which is no longer the Genscher party of the past, and it will be an unstable government compared to the past, which will make it more difficult to reach an agreement with Paris. And the next argument, which speaks against the bargain, is that you will have a Chancellor Merkel, who will be experiencing her toughest term in office. I think the years which you will have ahead of her will be much tougher than the years which you've had behind her. And I think that you will see that there will be tough headwinds and that you will see a lot of opposition within her own party, within the CDU and also within the sister party of the CDU, the CSU. And that if that's the case, it will make it much more difficult for her to push ambitious reforms ahead. And if that's the case, I think that there's even more of a reason to try to be quick in using this window of opportunity, because her political capital will be reducing as time passes by. And last but not least, an argument against the package deal is that there's an increasing opposition among the EU 25. There's skepticism, there are worries that the Germans and the French might come to an agreement and that they might try to dictate that agreement on others. That's one reason why you see the formation of new and interesting coalitions between the members of the EU 25. It's one reason why Tusk found an agreement on the leaders' agenda to show that it's not only Berlin and Paris which are dictating things. And some are fearing that the Germans and the French might go too far, and others are fearing that the Germans and the French might agree on things which will strengthen the intergovernmental notion of the European Union. If you take the example, for example, of the European Stability Mechanism and that being transformed into a European Monetary Fund, that might be an intergovernmentalization of Europe at the expense of supranational institutions, especially of the Commission. So since the summer break, I think that you can see less optimism, less hope, and less momentum. And I think that that is really bad news. Because, and I want to sum up with this, we need this kind of a win-win package deal in order to progress. I think it's possible, but I don't know whether we will get there. But what I know is that if you want to get there, you will need strong political will and strong political courage among the EU 27. And this, at the end of the day, is what leadership is about. And I am curious to see whether they will show this kind of leadership. Because if they don't, I think, and that I'm certain about, the defense of the European Union will not be strengthened. We will continue to muddle through. And if we continue to muddle through, we might find ourselves in future in bad weather conditions without having strengthened our defenses. And you know who will be cheering at that moment in time? It will be those who people call populists, who I would call authoritarian populists, if the EU is not able to defend itself against future storms. And it will play into their hands, into the hands of those who want to lead Europe in a different direction. So for me, this is a strong argument for an ambitious win-win package deal. Besides the ability of strengthening the ability of Europe to defend its interests in its region and globally, this, I think, is part of my personal narrative about the future of Europe. And I hope that the window of opportunity which has opened will be used, and that we will not find ourselves again in a year's time or in 2 years' time saying it was not used. I know it's difficult because you're not going to be operating under immediate crisis pressure, and the past years have shown that we only move if there's crisis pressure. But I hope that we will have learned our lesson from the past years and not commit the mistakes of the past. That was my attempt to sketch where I think we're standing today and what we need to be doing, and also an optimistic and pessimistic outlook of what might happen in the next months and the next year. I hope that was enough material for a discussion. And I'm happy to discuss also many other things, and I'm sure that Joe is already coming with questions which will go in the direction of what I said and beyond.